and welcome to another episode of the Type Tools podcast. I'm Jacie and we're here with expert Scott. Today we're going to be talking about the different ways that you can type people, some of the different methods of typing people and the pros and cons of them. Before we jump in, just a reminder, check the link in the bio for the handout. It's super helpful to help follow along as we talk through some of these concepts, whether it's preferences or the cognitive functions. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about typing methods. So there's so many different methods to typing. There's like preferences, there's letters, there's cognitive functions, there's even this thing called socionics. So why do you think there's so many different methods to type people?
Well, I think the reason why there might be a lot of different approaches is we're all looking at human cognition. In order to live as a human, you have to understand how people work. And so as people pay attention to different aspects of how people interact, they come up with their own theories, ideas, and systems. And then they'll say, this is the best and most comprehensive way of looking at it. And that's why we have things like strengths finders. We have things like, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is the one that is probably most familiar to people in business. You have DISC. You have all sorts of, and really what it is, people trying to either orient towards accuracy or efficiency. And everyone's trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to label and organize human cognition in a way that's understandable and useful. And I think that accounts for, and people have been doing that since the dawn of time, if you think about it.
So you think there's different ways to type people based on what they're using that typing for?
Yeah. And some is better in a theoretical capacity. So for instance, if we're discussing the way in which people think, that's different than determining what type they are, right? And you can, so for instance, if we're looking for behavioral characteristics, if we're looking for certain ways that people are speaking, maybe there's a pattern in the way that they're speaking that we can pick up on and look at. Or we can say, what is introverted thinking? And then, so it depends on if we want to stay in the abstract and the conceptual, or if we want to take it into the real world. So it's like, you have different types of businesses. So you have like idea businesses, you have physical execution, like you have restaurants and things that provide a service. And the same thing can be done with cognition. So it can be purely performative. So in that case, it would be something like, the only reason we're using personality and the only reason we're studying it is to get more output out of our workers or to make our family members like each other more. There's a motive and a goal in concrete reality. So then the way we think about psychology is then pushed through this filter, and then outcomes can be measured. Is the family happier? Do we have better understanding? Do we have more connection? However you're measuring it. And then on the business side, are we hitting our numbers better? Do people feel better when they come to work? Are they working harder? Do we have fewer errors? Are we making our shipments on time? And as ridiculous as it sounds, personality plays into each of those, and even in a business context. And so depending on what area we're trying to work on, it changes the way we use our tool set.
So recently you had a class, which I was a part of, and well, I guess it's not so much a class as just a call. It's more of a typology
workshop
discussion call.
Oh, yeah.
Where one of the people who attended the call, he was like a first time attendee. He was using the letters to type people other than the system you teach, which is more of the preferences and cognitive functions. So based on that experience, I don't know if letters only really works because it feels kind of reductive in some ways. So what are the strengths or weaknesses of just using the letters? And the letters being the I, E, S or N, T or F, P or J.
Yeah. So typing people based on those letters is... Okay, so what are the benefits of using a really simple system? So if you only have a hammer and you only have a screwdriver and you have to fix an engine, you can learn how to use a hammer. It's a very specific tool. You go bonk, bonk, and it does the thing. It moves an object, it hammers in an object. And then you have a screwdriver, and, that can take in and so it's easy for a person to learn those two tools. You know what it's supposed to do, you know what this one's supposed to do. But if you're trying to fix a complicated engine, you might need specific, more nuanced tools. Maybe you need a hammer with a longer arm, or you need a screwdriver that has a different head so that you can take out the different screws. So the benefit of having a simple system is it's easier to learn and you know what to do with it. So you could use a hammer to build a fort. You got some nails, you add some wood, you can build a little fort, and it doesn't have to hold up. Kids can use them. You know, obviously you probably want to be a little bit careful with ages and so on, but so that's the benefit of the simple one, is it's more accessible, it's more readily usable. But when you're talking about really specific use cases, it helps to have more advanced terminology and more specific ways of engaging. So if you have a hyper-specific task, you need a hyper-specific tool. So I remember when I built fences, we had, so you can get a nail gun. The whole system, this really complicated system, is designed to punch nails into things. It's got, you know, a pneumatic system that pumps air, that pressurizes and pushes the nail. And all the intellectual effort that went into that came from the original idea of the hammer. Yeah, the strength is in its simplicity. And the downside using something simple is it might not be case specific enough. Right? Like if you're looking for, you know, if you were in the medical community and you said you either have a cold or you have a fever, and those are the only two things you can have. Well, sometimes you're going to find a disease that doesn't fit neatly into those categories. And so now you have to expand your terminology to allow for these edge cases. But it's easier to think about like the qualities of a cold and the qualities of a fever. You can wrap your head around it, you can understand it more rapidly. But in fact, there's a lot more complexity out there. So it's a good entry point, but I don't think it's actually going to, in the case of a doctor, it's not going to get good outcomes because there's lots of problems and issues that aren't a cold and aren't a fever.
So Myers and Briggs emphasize the use of preferences, which is something that you do teach. And how is preferences different from saying I'm introverted or I'm intuitive? I think a lot of people, like, if they were typing by just the letters, for example, they'd be like, well, I'm an introvert, so I'm an I. But with the preferences, like, what is the difference between, like, saying I'm introverted, I'm an I, and using the preferences where it's, like, direct versus responding?
Okay, so it's kind of the same thing, but to expand on it a little bit. So you're an introvert if you have introverted preferences, but there's lots of ways in which you can be introverted. So if you're just looking for the responding preference, which means you like people to come to you, you like to quietly observe, you like to put things together, you like to spend time on your own, versus initiating, which is I'm going to start new topics. Like right now, I'm kind of initiating. I'm taking new angles. I'm taking new approaches to the question you asked instead of just staying right on the topic that you gave me. So this would be an example of initiating. And so, but the fact is, sometimes I'll be initiating, sometimes I'll be responding. So when we so what that means is in a certain context, if someone's only looking at initiating or responding, period, then they'll place me in a certain category. But in fact, I'll on occasion exhibit other behavior that isn't the original one. So preferences allows you to, and I think it's a more human approach, because it allows you to label behavior as it comes instead of just saying, we figured Jacie out, we know she's responding, she will never be initiating. So when we see anomalous behavior, preferences just say, this is what you prefer to do, and this is what you will generally do. Whereas I think what you were saying earlier about it being reductive, it disallows the person to be anything different from the preference that you've ascribed to them.
So we talked a little bit about the letters, we talked a little bit about the preferences. So what would be the advantage of typing through cognitive functions, and how can that provide more clarity than just the letters or just the preferences in some cases?
I think it provides an added layer of specificity. So it would be saying spicy versus the type of spicy. So if you eat something that's hot, that could be coming from pepper, that could be coming from cayenne, that could be coming from jalapenos, and they're all different types of spicy. Habanero is not the same as pepper, but they're all spicy. So when we're talking about cognitive functions, and let's go back to what you're saying. So the initiating cognitive functions land around the extroverted functions. So extroverted sensing, extrovert intuition, and so on. And the introverted functions are introverted thinking, introverted feeling, introverted sensing, and so on. So they're different flavors of the same thing. But if you wanted to have a more nuanced conversation, you would need to, like for instance, if you want to communicate the ingredients of a recipe, you would need to know exactly what type of spicy it was, right? So pepper, if you put pepper in, anyways, does that make sense? So cognitive functions lets us have a more specific language about a general trait.
I'm just realizing we should have said if you need context for the preferences or the cognitive functions, so there's episodes for that, and I'll go ahead and put it in the description box as well. So what would be the downside of just typing someone via the cognitive functions versus using like the preferences and the cognitive functions?
Well, first, you might type them incorrectly. And second, it would come down to, do you know how to identify those things? Have you practiced it?
When you say you might type them incorrectly, you mean it would probably be the same quadra. So if you're using the cognitive functions, even if you did get the cognitive functions correct, like I'm an INTJ and I share cognitive functions with an ESFP, for example. So if you're only doing the cognitive functions, it might be more difficult to understand where they are in their stack and therefore mistype them.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, returning to the food analogy, it's about quantities. So you might say, this person has introverted thinking. Let's say introverted thinking is garlic. And then you taste something that you eat and you're like, oh, there's garlic in this. And then you don't know how much garlic. Like you can't say, oh, it's a tablespoon of garlic. This is clearly a tablespoon of garlic. I'm eating it. It's much easier and much more accurate just to say garlic is here. And that's an easier thing to do than type for specific quantities. Think about how many super tasters are out there in the world. There really aren't too many. So it's not a reliable skill to be transferred to regular people. But being able to know what garlic tastes like, that's doable. So being able to know what introverted thinking is in whatever quantity is a lot more manageable than knowing, for instance, this is an INTP with TI hero, or this is an ISTP with TI parent. And so INTP would have a lot of TI, and ISTP would have a lot of TI, but in a different way. And so knowing all that complexity can be exhausting. So just being able to say, TI is here, this is what that looks like, is much more manageable.
And I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So you said 1, you might mistype them, in 2.
2, you might mistype them, and if you mistype them, it'd be the same as giving, so let's, because the whole purpose of this is to have an outcome, and the outcome in this case being, I understand this person more, I can integrate with them better, I can talk to them better, I can meet them at their level easier, so that's the outcome you're looking for, so that's what all of this is leading to. And if you mistype them, then you're going to be saying, okay, the outcome will be worse, because you're not giving them what they need, because on the front end you got it wrong. And invariably you will get it wrong. It's a skill that takes a long time to develop. But to avoid doing that, you just need to practice and have a better understanding of, what those different things are. In the same way that you'd want to taste a lot of things before you were good at it.
So what would you say are some of the common mistakes people run into when they're typing themselves? For example, like, I know you've said that with clients you work with, a lot of people will claim they're introverted just because they don't understand what extroversion means in the context of MBTI.
Yeah. So a lot of times you run into issues where, so in this case it's, I think I'm a certain way, but we're using a different language. So for instance, if you're saying I'm a great business leader, that means a lot of different things. And if we're looking for this kind of business leader, this kind of business leader, this kind of business leader, just saying you're good at it doesn't actually put you in a manageable space that can be communicated to other people. Like you could say I'm a great coach, that's a certain type of leadership. I'm a great trainer, that's a different type of leadership. I'm a good delegator, that's a different type of leadership. So people just say I'm a leader, but that doesn't actually allow you to do anything with it. And then additionally, that may just be their perception of themselves and not a shared perception that other people would agree with. And that's the benefit of having someone who looks at a lot of people, like me, for instance. So I've seen thousands of people. And so I have a better understanding of what type of leader, or in this case, what type you are. So they'll say, oh, I'm an introvert. And a lot of times what's happening there, and maybe they are introverted, first of all, so their self-diagnosis might be accurate. Or, it could be a recency bias. They might have spent 2 days alone and enjoyed it. And then they're like, I'm introverted. So recency. Or it could be a really loud personal event. So if you had something happen that was really difficult or traumatic, that's very memorable and you'll remember it. So for instance, I'm an INTP, and if there was one day that I felt something extremely strongly, let's say last year, I remember this really event, and I remember I was super emotional, and I was having all these issues, and they were very personal and subjective and feely. And then I take a personality test with that loud in my mind, and then I say, oh, well, Scott's clearly a feeler because he's answering. And when it's talking about feeling, I'm like, yes, that's true, because 2 years ago I remember it was this deeply emotionally and profoundly impactful moment. I'm a feeler. When in reality, on a regular basis, that isn't how I engage with the world. I'm much more likely to be analytical and focused, and just based off of this interview, I'm more explanatory in nature. And in point of fact, I'm not talking about my feelings. I'm not talking about things that are exciting or cool or crazy or whatever, which have a greater emotional tilt to them. And so as a result, so me having that being the case, I might go into a test and say I'm a feeler, which is not true. So that's one way that people can mistype. And some people might say, and some of it's about pride and some of it's about self-perception. I know if I type myself as an introvert, people might think less of me. I'm kind of disorganized. And if this is for purposes of getting a job, and then I share that my execution is disordered, then I might lose the job. And so as a result, I'm going to answer the way that I think my employer would like so that I can get the job, as opposed to being true to what is my personal experience. So these are reasons why people mistype all the time.
I think we did a whole episode on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely check that out. For listeners who have heard of socionics, and I just recently heard about it, how would you briefly explain it and how it compares to MBTI?
So we have MBTI, which is the NSTF, and that's as far as it goes. And then so the thing I'm doing is not MBTI, but if we're comparing MBTI with socionics, MBTI leans towards the person and how they think and how they feel and what their preferences are. Socionics leans towards how a person integrates with the group. So think about psychology versus sociology. They're both the study of people, but psychology is narrowing in on the person, and socionics is narrowing in on the group dynamic. So there isn't much of a space in socionics where they're engaging with the person outside of how they interact with others. So the emphasis is on what is the type of relationship an INTP and an INTJ share? Socionics. That's what they're interested in. What do these dynamics look like? Can we name them? Can we label them? So they're more interested in the group. Not that they have nothing about the smaller pieces, the personality types, but the personality types are used for the purposes of figuring out how they connect with other people. Whereas MBTI or Jungian psychology or typology, which would be more of what I do, is oriented towards figuring out exactly how you engage. It's more granular, it's more personal, it's more subjective.
I heard that socionics was developed by Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that they would want to understand how they could get their workers to perform better. Mm-hmm. Soviet Russia wasn't really interested in how can we make the individual more unique and happy and cater to their individual specific wants and desires. They were very much how can we make everyone more efficient?
Yeah, and that's an important question.
Yeah.
And certainly understanding how you fit into the world and context of others is important. So yeah, you might argue that given the tilt that Western societies have towards the individual and how Eastern societies tilt towards the group, it makes sense following that socionics, and it's using a lot of the same materials, but for a different directive or a different drive.
And the outcomes are different. And I think this is really important because I didn't realize this when someone came to your discussion call. that the letters actually ultimately end up being different. Like apparently I'm an INTJ in typology or MBTI, but in socionics I would be an INTP.
Yeah.
So it's a very different conversation if you think you're speaking the same language, but you're not.
Yeah, and actually to clarify a little bit, the reason why you would be an INTP, and in this case I would be an INTJ, is because T and F, those functions are judging functions. They're making judgments. They're either making intellectual judgments, idea judgments, true, false, or value judgments. So you're cutting something down based on different criteria. Is it true, is it false, is in the domain of thinking in T. And then, is it good? Is it worthy? Is it valuable? Is it appreciated? Is it enjoyed? Does the tribe like this? Do I like this? Those are also judgments, but they're of the feeling domain. So, the reason why in socionics you would... So as an INTJ, you lead with actually what's called a perceiving function, which is introverted intuition, which is absorbing information, distilling information. So since you lead with that, you would be an INTP, designating that you're a perceiver. And then for the INTP, I'm leading with a judging function with introverted thinking, so I would be a J, and that's how they're separating them. And then with MBTI, it's basically saying, do you use extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking in your top two functions? If you do, you are a J. So INTJ, extroverted thinking parent, the second one down in your functional stack is extroverted thinking, so you're a J.
So it prioritizes the introversion, extroversion versus the actual function that you lead with.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap us up, if someone is just getting started in typology, where do you recommend they start? With the letters, the preferences, the cognitive functions, or should they just like wildcard it with some socionics?
Well, I don't think socionics lends itself to beginners because immediately it's complicated. And also, usually when people are doing this, they want a horoscope. They want something to find interesting about themselves. Certainly that's leaning towards a Western audience who's more interested in individual stuff. So people love tests. People love personality tests. Tell me about myself. So start with a personality test and just understand that you might not be good at taking those tests. You may take them wrong, and the test itself might not be well generated, and thus trusting its results implicitly and strongly might be risky. But if you take multiple tests and they orient in a similar direction, either one, your bias has continued throughout all the tests. So that's why sometimes it's helpful to have other people take the test as if they were you. And that way it allows for at least a more objective perception of self. And then you can reconcile the differences. Well, like if you had your wife take it for you, you'd be like, well, and then ultimately you wouldn't want to be like, hey babe, I took this test, I got ENTJ. And the reason I got ENTJ is because I'm a leader and I'm strong and I'm assertive and I'm highly organized. And essentially you're compelling the other person to answer in a way that would orient itself towards the result that you were most interested in getting. And obviously that would be less objective. You're less likely to actually generate results that are true. So avoid doing that. So try to come at it as agnostic as possible and as objective as you can. And, that's going to be a problem. But that's not a bad place to start, is just take a test. Think about yourself in these ways. It's beneficial. No matter how you do it, on some level, you'll gain a certain level of clarity. Now, I would not stop with the test because, again, I don't think there's... In the same way at the beginning of our podcast, we talked about the hammer and the screwdriver. This is knowing enough about mechanics to use a hammer. And that's fine, but if you ever wanted to build anything, you need to know more things. Like, you need to know how to cut wood, you need to know how to measure properly and all these things, and you're going to get that by understanding cognitive functions. So I would take a test, fine. If that's as much interest as you have, if you have 15 minutes of passing interest, take a test. But if you want to actually have results that you can use in real life, you need to understand the functions, because that's what's going to communicate to you actually how you engage. So do you use introverted thinking? And this in turn allows you to communicate that to other people. Like if you understand yourself, this is my process and this is how it works, you'll be able to communicate that to others. And also you'll have a skill set that will allow you to engage with yourself and your challenges in the way that makes sense. And this is why, again, in the medical community, they'll say this is the name of this specific disease and these are the things associated with that disease. Obviously, I don't think people are diseased, but this is one of the few places where people label and contextualize things. And we do that so we can share that information with other people, so we can move and engage more dynamically. So don't stop with the personality tests. Do learn a little bit about cognitive functions and what those mean. And I think that would be a reasonable start. So you can go on Reddit, you can go online, you can learn about introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing, all the jargon. But that jargon applies to you. So I have more of this, I have more of that, and that can be helpful too. And I think it's a lot better than just saying, I'm an N or I'm an S. Like, there's more you can do with it. You can actually say, okay, I'm an introverted thinker. And the reason I keep saying because I am an introverted thinker. So I'm an introverted thinker, so it matters a lot to me that things make sense. It doesn't matter that everyone else agrees that it makes sense. I have to determine for myself that it makes sense. And if I don't, it's very difficult for me to move forward. I have low extroverted sensing. And so as a result, doing physical tasks and engaging in team sports takes a while to learn. I can learn it just like anybody else. Anybody can do anything. It's just how easy is it to acquire those skills? And if you have a low tolerance for extroverted sensing, it will take more time to develop those skills. And if you don't have a knowledge of the functions and how you line up in those areas, then you won't be able to make those judgment calls. Either one, to say, this is a hard task for you. You're doing a hard task right now. You should congratulate yourself for doing a hard task, even though it's easy for other people. This is hard for you. And then you can say, this is my superpower. This is easy for me. I'm an introverted thinker. Thinking about things, analyzing them is like breathing. It's easy. It's natural. And so as a result, I can walk into a situation, use that skill set that people find valuable or struggle with themselves. And it's just about self-awareness and context.
Yeah, I definitely found when I first learned about typology, it was like, okay, first I'm going to learn about the letters, then I'm going to learn about the preferences, and then I'm going to learn about the cognitive functions. But oh wait, the order of the cognitive functions matters. And it's like this constantly expanding rabbit hole. And then there's like cognitive looping and like compatibility and so many things you can explore. So definitely check out the other episodes if you haven't already. And then I was also going to recommend, if you are interested in getting the quick version of figuring out what type you are accurately and like working through some of the dynamics and strengths and weaknesses of your type, you could always book a session with Scott at toolswithscott.com. And I think that wraps up our episode for today, unless you had anything else.
No, thanks.
All right, thanks for watching today, guys. See you in the next one.
See you guys.